didn't have a camera, but yeah, I don't know, let's just start the conversation. So we told everybody we're going to have a conversation about the Electoral College. I guess we should maybe introduce ourselves. My name's Hunter Blackburn, and you are Robert.
Burr, uh, and it is an immense pleasure to be joining you for this chat.
Yeah, you too. So
I don't think we've actually spoken, like, voice-wise
not for a while.
since UNR? I mean,
Since softball, that would have been back in 2013.
oh, that's right,
Mhm. Yeah,
yes.
yeah, but yeah, no, we went to UNR together. We saw each other pretty often around the school there. I don't know that we ever had a
Re-
class together, did we? Maybe we did.
No classes. We had a conversation once, though, outside the College of Education, during which some gal came up to you and asked for a cigarette.
Oh,
And I said something about, like, why don't you get your own cigarettes? And she was extremely aggravated and left. And I believe you were like, wow, you probably just ruined her entire day. It's a fond memory I have.
you got a better memory than me. I don't recall. She probably
Oh, okay.
she didn't mean anything.
Yeah, right.
If she was asking me for a cigarette, yeah, it sounded like more trouble than it was worth.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Good.
so your post about the Electoral College, you basically said that people don't understand it, and for I don't know anybody that doesn't understand what the Electoral College is, it's laid out in Article 2 of the Constitution, basically, or I thought it was wasn't there something else in the 12th Amendment?
Yes, well, the 12th Amendment changes some aspects to the Electoral College, but you are correct. The thing that really sort of drives me crazy, and I've noticed lately, I see an abundance of memes being shared on Facebook and social media about the Electoral College, and they usually have something to do with depicting, the most populous cities or states in the country, being like, this is why we have the Electoral College, because these states would dominate otherwise. And the thing is it seems like most arguments about the Electoral College, either for or against, most of the time no one seems to actually know what they're talking about. It's literally like that episode of The Simpsons where Homer is trying to teach Apu about citizenship stuff
Right.
and says, we all know that the 13 stripes on the flag stand for good luck. But what did the 47 stars stand for?
Well, hold on. So then, before we get too ahead of ourselves, so for anybody that's not familiar with the Electoral College, essentially, when you vote for president and vice president, you're not making a direct election of those individuals. You're actually electing people that are called electors. And so after November 6th, those electors then go and cast a vote. And typically never really, I can't remember the term that's used. If they were to actually vote against the candidate that they were voted in to vote for.
Oh, yeah. If they did not vote for the candidate they're allegedly pledged for, they're referred to as a faithless elector.
Okay.
We actually had a fair number of those in this last presidential election.
Is that right?
Yeah, but it's really quite extraordinary. I mean, occasionally it happens. You have one elector who, and they've never changed the results of elections. Someone's just expressing their discontent with maybe who their party's candidate was. That occasionally happens. It's usually one person. But in this case, in 2016, we had 5 different people, in addition to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, receive electoral votes. I believe they included John Kasich, Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, someone named Spotted Owl, and Colin Powell received 3 electoral votes.
Wow.
So
that's impressive. Wasn't even running.
Wasn't even running. Yes.
Oh, here we go. There's an article in Wikipedia about it, apparently.
Oh, yes, faithless electors. Yeah.
In any event, it didn't actually do its job. So.
Yeah. No. Well,
the point of being able to have faithless elector was to prevent someone like Donald Trump from becoming president.
Well, that really goes to the important thing that we should get to concerning like the origin of the Electoral College is it's sort of we have this conception of it as being like, oh, these states get this amount of weight that they can project, but really the original intention that say Madison and Hamilton had for the Electoral College was they envisioned it as you were really electing the electors. These guys were going to go on and deliberate and consider who would be a great president. And part of that was, yes, to prevent someone who may have be riling up a large
Popular,
segment of the
a populist,
general
yeah.
populace. Yeah,
Right.
These were people that were going to select, someone who was like a statesman. I guess the idea is that we'd get Washingtons and Adams and Jeffersons all the way on. Uh, so, and the idea was that like they would actually be elected not on a statewide basis, but each district, like a district would select an elector. And this elector would be someone that the people in the district had esteem for, and he would go on to consider and give, the idea was like,
So
I
I know
mean,
we're kind of getting into the weeds though. So I just wanted, before we get into too
oh yeah,
detailed of a discussion, I want to make sure that it was clear to anybody that is listening to this, that what the Electoral College is. And so there's a number of electors, um,
hmm
and it's broken up by the population. So you have X number of electoral votes based on the population of your state,
right.
and it's
California has 55, Nevada has 6,
like Wyoming
uh,
has like 5 or something,
3.
3. Yep.
Yeah.
Um, but so yeah, it's based on the number of people that you have in your state, and then so
There's a total of 538, and you have to win at least 270 in order to be
right.
elected president.
But so one of the issues that people have with that is that, let's say in Wyoming, and I don't remember all of the numbers here, but roughly there's 40 million people in California, and that they get 53, 55 votes, you said. Whereas in
hmm
Wyoming, they have a little less than a million people, maybe 800,000 people, and they have those 3 votes. So proportionately, a vote in Wyoming is going to have more weight than a vote in California. And
That
so,
is true.
one
Yes.
of the biggest concerns is that your vote is not one man, one vote.
Yes, that's accurate. This is partly, even though the electoral votes are based off population, because there's this minimum threshold of each state gets at least 3 for your congressional representation. So 2 for both your senators and at least 1 for a member of the House. It does mean that you can be a very sparsely populated state and you'll still have 3 compared to, California. You're going to have more voters for each electoral vote. So technically, yes, yeah, a voter in Wyoming has a little bit more punch with their vote. It represents, slightly higher percentage of what it takes to create a electoral vote.
And so the other reason then, aside from trying to prevent the election of a populist demagogue, is also that it gave smaller states the ability to have a little bit more influence in a presidential election. And I think one of the main criticisms of that you hear often is that it's a rule that was put in place to benefit states where the majority of the people were African slaves, and the voting populace was much smaller.
Yes, I'm aware that this is an issue. I haven't studied this aspect of it too much. I mean, I'm aware that uh, obviously that famous 3/5 clause
Mhm.
to how we count population regarding slaves. Though the thing about that was actually a device create as jarring as it is to see that as part of our history. It was a device at the time created by people who were opposed to, the slave states having disproportionate amount of power, because if the slaves were counted as a whole person, it would give more congressional representation to the southern states that they otherwise wouldn't get.
Despite the fact that they weren't part of the voting populace, they would just be counted as part of the population. Just make that clear.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So yes, as to whether the Electoral College benefited the slave states, I'm not necessarily sure I'm on board with whether that is something that really panned out. The thing is, since the electoral votes are roughly proportional to population, whether you're doing a national popular vote or a electoral vote, that still means that the northern states are going to outweigh the southern states. So with the election of, say, Abraham Lincoln in 1860, I mean, he wasn't even on the ballot in almost every state in the South. I think Virginia was the only state that ended up in the Confederacy that he was on the ballot in, but he didn't need to be, because by consolidating the vote in the North, he easily won the election.
So is it fair to say that you think the Electoral College is something that should persist and remain?
Well, I can understand why people may get that impression speaking with me, but my sentiments on it are more from a practical perspective, which is to actually push through a constitutional amendment, radically, change how we select the president. I feel that for the results that we would get for what would be an extraordinary amount of effort to make that happen, basically we would mostly be creating probably two results. One is, yes, we'd eliminate that 5% of the time where the candidate who wins the popular vote is not the one who's elected president. And we would probably change which suburbs receive a lot of presidential campaign attention. But and yes, if I had to choose, like if I could just choose a new electoral system for the United States, I would probably not go with what we have now, because it's sort of, what we have now is this weird hybrid, excuse me, where it's not how the founders originally intended, where we were actually electing independent electors who were going to make the selection of the president. In some ways, it's just sort of this weird translation that happens of the popular vote in various states. But the thing is I don't, for the problems that are facing the United States in terms of some of the broken aspects of our politics, I think that the amount of effort it would take to abolish the Electoral College would probably be better spent doing things like maybe switching us from the sort of first past the post voting system that we have in our elections today to something like a ranked choice, and then also, putting a stake through the heart of gerrymandering, which I think is probably the most poisonous thing that's happening to our politics.
Well, how would you even undo gerrymandering at this point, with all the way that they've drawn the lines and redrawn the lines? I mean, you could potentially draw a grid and just say, okay, in this grid, there's X number of districts, and however many people fall within those lines, then you determine I don't know. I mean, that you have to do something.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there is a bit of a Cold War or aspect to, like, any attempt to solve gerrymandering just encourages people to come up with clever ways to get around it. But I think that, I mean, there are a variety of methods. Having an independent commission to draw the lines and have stipulations that they have to be, represent roughly proportionate to what the state's partisan distribution is. Or one thing that's been mentioned, and it's not necessarily something I am on board for, but I understand how it works, and it would theoretically work, would be to expand the membership of Congress, because the more members you dump into there in the House of Representatives, it's been shown that it would make it more difficult to gerrymander. Now, I'm not particularly keen on the idea of paying an extra 400 or 500 people to occupy the Congress, but if it does mean stopping gerrymandering, at least to some degree, I would be on board with it.
Hmm. So for anybody that doesn't understand what gerrymandering is, maybe just explain that real quick.
Oh, yes. It's basically you can get different results for, say, which people are elected to Congress from your state based off how the districts are drawn. So you could easily change a situation where you, say, have 2 Republicans and 7 Democrats elected from a state. If you draw the lines so as to, say, pack as many Democrats into just a few districts as possible, so you might have this district that has like 90% Democrats, and thus the remaining 4 neighboring districts just don't have enough Democrats to elect a candidate. You could easily shift the partisan balance. And it's something that's been going on for very early on in our republic.
Essentially, our representatives are able to draw the lines to keep themselves in power more frequently.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the gag on this is a lot of people like to describe it as, with gerrymandering, it's not the voters choosing the representatives. The representatives are choosing the voters. And yes, like 80% of the House does not face a competitive election in the general election. Mm-hmm. But what they may face is a very fierce primary election. And that's part of the reason why our politics are so polarized, is if you're a member of the House and you know there's no chance that the person you're going to face in the general election has any hope of beating you, but you're facing a more extreme member of your party, possibly in the primary, you're going to have a lack of incentive to compromise and work in a bipartisan manner in Washington.
So, forgive me. What you weren't clear on whether or not you think that we should maintain the Electoral College, or what would replace it?
Well, I think
you don't think a direct vote should be the way that we elect all representatives?
If I had my choice to just create a new electoral system for the United States that could be implemented, wasn't going to require a Herculean amount of effort to change, I probably would go with some form of national popular vote. But the thing with that is there's different models that we could use for that, and I'm not necessarily on board with certain ones. I think most people, when they envision the idea of the United States choosing its president by a popular vote, they're thinking that whoever gets the most votes would be the one who's elected president, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not necessarily a majority of the population. I mean, a national popular vote could theoretically be just as disenfranchising for many voters as the Electoral College. Say we end up having a system where there's 3 or 4 or even 5 parties. That doesn't seem likely, but if we're in a situation where we're getting rid of the Electoral College, perhaps politics is, shifting incredibly in all sorts of ways. A candidate could potentially get 23% of the vote, 24, and end up being elected president.
Hmm. Well,
So you,
under the Electoral College, aren't we still only dealing with a really small percentage of the electorate that's even casting votes anyways, it seems like, especially when you don't have candidates that are really rallying so much support. I mean,
well, turnout definitely is not so great in our elections as the years, most recent decades have gone by. That's true. And, you know,
well, and
but
there's no requirement that everybody vote.
right. No, absolutely. Well, yes. And you're right. Like if we had a national popular vote, uh, compared to the Electoral College, it could be that only 50% turns out, or it could be that 80% turns out. And certainly I would want turnout to be ideally as great as possible so that way everyone's engaged. But what I meant was that say even we have an 80 or 90% turnout. What if the vote between candidates is split 5 ways and 24% vote for this candidate who gets in? That means that 76% of the country had a preference for someone who wasn't him.
Well, so how do they deal with this in other countries? Because they have multi-party elections in Italy, and they have similar elections throughout Europe. I'm most familiar, I think, with Italy, but they have coalitions that they form. Essentially, you have 20 different. I'm not sure the number, but you have 20 different political parties, and through a process of elimination, you build coalitions based on who.
Right. That's true. Of course, a lot of those you're dealing with a parliamentary system. So if you put together a coalition of parties in the parliament or whatever body it is, the idea is that they'd eventually you put together a coalition that would roughly represent a majority of the population. Uh, but with the United States, since we're a presidential system, you know, 24 like a 24% of the country could elect someone, uh, and the rest, everyone else doesn't have any input, essentially. Like, I mean, that's the thing when you run into people who say that like a vote for a third party is a wasted vote.
Mhm.
That's true, but a vote for any party, whether minor or major, if that candidate, if you're just doing what we have in the United States, which is plurality, first person past the post voting, which is just you show up, you vote for a candidate, whichever candidate happens to have the most. It doesn't have to be a majority, which is 50% plus one, just the most. So that could be 47%, that could be 37%.
Mhm.
Um, when you have a system like that, essentially anyone who voted for someone who didn't get elected, their vote literally translates into nothing. Now, there's a number of electoral systems that sort of work in a way to address that. One is proportional representation, which a lot of European countries use, which is if you're voting for, your parliament, the seats are distributed roughly based off how the votes were distributed, though you
Right.
can tinker around with all sorts of different mechanics to make that less or more proportional.
Well, so essentially, despite you have these multi-party system where you build coalitions in order to in order to build up to what 2 or 3 candidates for the prime minister or president, whatever that country has, you still have proportional representation in parliament, is what you're saying. So
Right. Like,
if your
so yeah,
party's 30% of the electorate, you're guaranteed at least 30 seats out of 100.
yes. And even in that situation, if a prime minister, if their party only got 30%, but if they're in a coalition with a party that got 22%, that essentially means that a majority of the country's population, their voice got heard. They're voting.
If this was the United States, we would guarantee a certain percentage of seats to democratic socialists, to libertarians, to independents, to whatever, any number of other political parties that are out there that are essentially that voiceless, that they really don't have much teeth anywhere. They're lucky if they do get even one or two representatives elected. In fact, I'm not sure that there are any, aside from maybe uh, what's his name? His dad ran for president, the libertarian guy.
Oh, Rand Paul. Well, I
Rand
mean,
Paul.
Rand Paul had to run. He ended up having to run. Yes, his ideology is mostly libertarian, but he had to run for the under the Republican Party banner.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Third parties in the United States are absolutely anemic compared to much of the rest of the world. There's occasionally a member of the House is an independent. Bernie Sanders is an example, and then Angus King, one of the senators from Maine, is an independent. Those usually require like substantial a candidate to have like a substantial connection with the voters of the state. There's a few third party members in some state legislatures, like some Greens and a few Libertarians and whatnot. But yeah, proportional representation would ensure that basically the preferences of the voters are translated the most literally in terms of the distribution of seats. Though I'm not even necessarily for proportional representation either, because
Would that do away with the need for gerrymandering if we were doing proportional representation? Would that stop that sort of district line drawing?
yes, if you're doing it as, say, a statewide election for a slate of candidates.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, if if you go to the ballot box in California and you're using proportional representation, what you might have, and there's of course, a variety of systems, but it might be you're given a ballot and you have lists between each party has their own list of candidates for, 53 members of the House. And you might, in some countries, you might just have marked that's the list you're voting for. Other countries let you sort of rank the candidates on the list, or all sorts of different ways. But yeah, so if, your vote for a Democrat, for the Democrat list, gets added to all the other votes and they get 60% of the vote, then that means 60% of their House delegation is going to be Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Your stance that it would take so much effort to change the way that we manage this system? What's the difference today with managing issues like that versus when we made alcohol illegal and then turned around and made it legal? I mean, that if it's such a difficult task, clearly we were able to do it twice in that case.
Well, yes, I'm not saying it would be impossible, but I think
But what's different about
that,
today versus back in the 1920s?
well, it's not so much that changing the Constitution is more difficult than back then. It's just, I mean, keep in mind though that like things like prohibition, that was preceded by decades of social reform movement. But my point is not so much that it's impossible, we shouldn't even try, but I feel that people try, particularly, the Democrats I know, they treat the abolishing the Electoral College as this panacea. And they're like,
Well, so
people
do
are just,
Republicans, though. So when Republicans or conservatives in general are impacted by it, then they want to see it disappear. So it's
absolutely. I
yeah.
mean,
When your guy's
that's one.
winning, it's great. When your guy's losing, it's the worst thing that could have ever happened. So
Oh, I saw this prior to the 2016 election. I saw individuals who were saying something like, one of them would say a pro-Trump person. And they're like, oh, it doesn't matter, what happens, because the electors are going to make the decision themselves. They don't care about the will of we the people. And then the election happened, and they're like, thank goodness for the Electoral College. And it's, yeah, exactly. But you're absolutely right. You're often, most people's views of the Electoral College are shaded on whether they think it's beneficial to their side or not. I mean, that's one of the things that's sort of lost is there was some Republican sentiment about not necessarily abolishing the Electoral College, but doing something to change it prior, because there had been this impression that from the 2008 and 2012 elections that the Democrats just had this insurmountable blue wall of the coastal states and the Midwest, and they're just despondent, like we'll never be able to breach that wall. There was even like a plan where the state legislature in Michigan, which was controlled by Republicans, they're contemplating changing how the electoral votes were distributed in that state so that they would be either based off districts, or maybe it would have been proportional representation, proportional to the votes cast. I'm not sure which, under the idea that, well, Hillary's going to carry this state, but maybe we can get some votes for Trump. Though the irony, of course, is if they had done that, it would have turned out that it would have detracted from Trump's vote total and added to Hillary's.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
well,
yeah.
and California is an interesting beast too, because it's not as though it's devoid of conservatives. There are definitely a lot of conservative voters that live there. I mean, I'm not entirely familiar with how Arnold Schwarzenegger came to be elected. Excuse me.
Well, his was sort of a exceptional case because it was done in that. No, I myself am having a bit of a scratchy throat. He came to office initially through a recall mechanism. Who was it? Was it Gray Davis was the previous governor?
Jerry Brown.
No.
Jerry before Schwarzenegger? Yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah,
but I mean, clearly, I mean, the state elected a more conservative candidate. I mean, and somewhat ridiculous as well. I mean,
there's two things you have to keep in mind there. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a moderate Republican,
mm-hmm.
so he's not as poisonous as any sort of more hardline conservative candidate who may have been put up. But also because of the recall mechanism, you had this situation where multiple candidates were running, even ones from the same party. I don't recall the percentage that each candidate got, but I believe Schwarzenegger received 40-something% of the vote.
Mm-hmm. So
now,
he just edged his way into there, but I mean, clearly, there's an electorate there in California that it's not just a blue state, clearly.
Well, yeah, I think, part of this, part of it, I think, is that the Republican Party in California for the past couple of decades has not seriously sat down and thought, how can we appeal beyond like the base of 36% of the population? Mm-hmm. Instead, they just seem to want to sit on their hands and moan about how unfair the world is. But yeah, I think there's plenty of states where they're either blue or red, but a candidate from the opposite party could potentially win. Massachusetts is an example that they're a very blue state, but they almost seemingly always elect Republicans for governor more often than not. And I think that's mostly just that's a function of a large segment of the state wanting like a check on the Democrat legislature. With California, though, I think the Republican Party they poisoned the well with Hispanic voters in the early mid-90s with what was it, Proposition 180 something? I can't remember.
What was it for?
But it was to deny any sort of hospital visitation or anything regarding illegal immigrants. And the thing is prior to that ballot ballot question, the Republican Party in California, if I recall correctly, more or less was able to split the Hispanic vote with Democrats.
Hmm. And that's
Maybe
because
not.
of sort of a predominantly Catholic electorate, I think, right?
Right. That's
More
the thing.
conservative. Yeah.
Yeah, you see something similar in Texas because Texas, I believe, is actually a white minority state by this point. But the Republican Party in Texas has been able to do fairly comparatively well with Hispanic voters. Um, but so in California, after that ballot proposition, which was being banged on very heavily in support of by Pete Wilson, who nonetheless, he managed to win the election because he had basically a opponent who was a non-entity, a very weak opponent. Uh, but that that ballot proposition and the Republican Party support for it poisoned the well. And since then, yeah, I think Arnold Schwarzenegger is the only Republican who's been elected to statewide office in California since. Now, you know, what the Republicans in California should do is sit down and be like, okay, what are the things we're willing to compromise on to bring people into our coalition so that we can win some offices on the statewide level? But it doesn't seem like they're interested in doing that. Instead,
Hmm.
you get all sorts of stuff like, I'm sure you've heard of the State of Jefferson movement.
Oh, yeah, where they want to split up California. Don't they want to split it up into like 4 different states? So you'd have southern, like 2 in the middle, so you'd have central and then upper central and then like the most northern portion of it, or is that not correct?
Well, that's partially correct because the State of Jefferson movement, originally it was to sort of allow the northern part of California to become its own state. But if, as is my understanding, the movement itself actually split up with the people splitting off, proposing instead this 4-state or 3 or 4 state division. But yeah, but basically, yes, it's about trying to divide up the state. And I mean, I understand maybe the appeal of it if you're a Republican living in rural Northern California and you feel like your vote literally does not affect anything. I mean, really, the much of California politics in the last near decade has mostly been sort of the is left Democrats versus centrist Democrats, and the Republicans are just this irrelevant afterthought.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I can see the appeal, but the thing is yeah, it probably, it's not something that's likely to happen. And by engaging in these fantasies, and I see it here in Nevada too, people are like, oh, well, we should just divide up Nevada so Clark County won't be able to determine our elections anymore. It's like, okay, well, that's an interesting thought, but that's really just distracting you from sitting down and thinking, what do we need to do to win on the statewide basis again? Now, Grant, you have to be willing to, you're going to have to think really hard. What are the things that we want to hold on to, and what issues can we, given other people who may be interested in some of what we're selling, but we're poisonous to them in other ways.
So I know that you're a Kucinich fan, so I think that's probably becoming more obvious to anybody that's listening. But
Wait,
what
did you say Kucinich rather than Kasich?
Kasich? Okay, sorry, yeah, Kasich, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. I hadn't thought about before about how similar their
Their
names
names,
are,
yeah.
and they're both from Ohio, so there's something going on there.
But so there's a huge divide, I'd say, and maybe multiple divides within the Republican Party of Republicans who would want to see a candidate like Kasich, who would want to see a candidate like Jeb Bush, who would want to see a candidate like John McCain,
Hmm.
and ultimately the party was able to be manipulated into the populist realm. And I don't see it coming back from that without a major shift in and how it defines itself. I mean, I think the Democratic Party has some of the same challenges, and I think that we see the Democratic Socialist movement is definitely picking up some traction. I'm not
Hmm.
and not entirely opposed to that. I don't think that it's a danger necessarily, and I think by making that statement, I'm hopefully inviting I'm going to call him Dr.
Connecticut.
Kucinich.
Dr. And I believe he's also living in Ohio now.
Yeah, nice. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Perfect. It's even more confusion. But
But Dr.
inviting him
K.
because he's definitely not a big fan of the Green New Deal, and so I wanted to hear his opinion about that. Maybe we can get him on at some point. Um,
Well, and then certainly.
once he sees how ineffective this is going to be.
Come now, Hunter. Surely he'll want to be on a program that's listened to by dozens of vague acquaintances and friends of ours.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the thing with when you have in the United States, you have two big parties. You're going to have a situation. What they are is they're coalitions. Now, if we were in Europe, we would probably have a situation where if we had proportional representation, where, yeah, we would have a Democratic Socialist Party led by Bernie Sanders. You would have a liberal centrist party led by Hillary Clinton. You would have a center-right Republican Party led by Kasich. You would probably have some sort of religious conservative party headed by Ted Cruz. And then you'd have like a nationalist populist party headed by Donald Trump. And I do agree with you. I think, unfortunately, the Republican Party is probably going to be stuck on this nationalist populist track for a while, just because part of that is, I think, one thing to keep in mind is political parties, they're always changing. You have people who leave one, join another. These coalitions always rearrange around. We call them realignments in political science. They happen like every 30 years. I mean, look at a map of the 1948 election and then a map of the 1968 presidential election, and the states are almost flip-flopped in terms of whether they're voting Republican or Democrat. And so, yeah, I think, unfortunately, you have a situation where, I mean, it's unfortunate from my perspective, where I would like a center-right, pro-business, smallish government party, though I'm moderate in many ways, and I'm willing to accept, government in many aspects as long as it's done in particular, uh, and done in a particular way. But I think what we have is we're really seeing a realignment, and obviously at the epicenter of it is white collar, no, not white collar, white blue collar workers who, uh, many of whom are probably lifelong Democrats, are now more in the Republican Party orbit, specifically sort of in the Trump orbit. And you've seen a lot of like pro-business center-right people drift away from the Republicans and become Democrats. I know several people who are in this. For them, it's kind of a strange experience. They're they're both anti-Trump, but also like anti-Sanders. So they kind of like feel squeezed in the middle or whatnot. But yeah, I think the Republican Party is going to be a mess for a while. And I think regardless of whether they lose or win the next presidential election, I think they're on a track for some really electorally painful experiences, because while they have consolidated the rural small town vote, and that did help them win Senate races in Missouri, North Carolina, Indiana, the price they paid for that is Trump is absolutely toxic in the suburbs.
Mhm.
And that's part of the reason why Democrats were able to win the House, despite having a very heavy Republican gerrymander, was that the Republican Party became so toxic in the suburbs that, the Democrats were able to win 40 seats, the most they've won in the House since Watergate aftermath. And what's interesting about that is if you look at some of the places that they picked up seats, they were in states like Utah and Oklahoma, Kansas, South Carolina, and these were voters who were probably lifelong Republicans who usually just automatically voted Republican, but are now at least purple. But yeah, but the thing is parties change all the time. Uh, 20 years from now, who knows what sort of coalitions we could be looking at.
Mhm. Well, what's your prediction?
Oh,
Where do you see
as
where do
to,
you see the Democratic Party going this time around for the president?
right. Well, it is interesting to watch. I mean, certainly, I think in the last primary, Bernie Sanders was sort of representative of, for a few years before, there had been this sense amongst like left-wing activists that they were kind of taken granted for by the Democratic Party. And I remember, even in 2015 or 2014 talk of like maybe Elizabeth Warren was going to be their chosen champion to challenge the Democratic establishment. And I think part of what Bernie Sanders tapped into was he was someone who was just sort of explicitly saying what they wanted to hear explicitly said all
You think
along.
that that's what Bernie Sanders does, really? Hmm.
Well, I mean, he's tapping like there's he's addressing many of the like the policy preferences for the left wing of the party that weren't really. I mean, they certainly weren't being addressed by Clinton,
Mhm.
and activists for a lot of activists in the left wing activists in the party, like during the Obama years, kind of felt neglected. Um, I think Bernie Sanders was the candidate who was able to make a connection with them. I know. I think Martin O'Malley, was that his name? The Democrat
Oh,
governor of
O'Malley.
Maryland.
Yeah,
O'Malley,
O'Malley.
yeah.
Mhm.
But I think he was the one who was hoping to tap into that, but he got eclipsed by Bernie, who made the real connection.
He gained a lot of traction. It was really surprising to see that that he wasn't the nominee. And some of what I think came out of that was people felt like there was active voter suppression happening during the primaries 4 years ago. Do you recall that?
Well, yeah, I've heard, there's the allegation that the it was rigged, but what what was it that was actually what rigged the primaries? Because what I've heard is stuff like, Hillary, the questions and debates were inappropriately shared with Hillary Clinton
I think that
before
was
the
just like one
debates.
question. I mean, I don't think that they have like a pattern of that happening. I think there was just that one
Okay.
email, but the primaries being rigged, I think what people were complaining about was that there were literally mile-long lines of people coming to vote for Sanders, and those votes apparently never got counted because they never allowed those people to cast their vote or whatever. I guess that was happening in Arizona. I'm not entirely sure, but.
Oh, yes, I do recall something in the news concerning Arizona and long lines, but I don't know the details.
From what I remember, it wasn't just Arizona though, but Arizona I think had a hearing where they allowed a lot of people to come in and explain in sort of an open city council meeting what they felt was essentially illegal activity on the part of the Democratic Party suppressing their ability to vote for their candidate. So.
So basically, like they were in a long line, and at some point there was just a cutoff, and they weren't able to go in and cast a ballot.
I'm
Uh,
not sure. I mean,
yeah.
what, it's been well, 5 years now almost, or whatever, 4 years.
Right.
I don't recall everything.
Right. Well, yeah, no, I understand. Well, yeah. Well, the thing is like if it was a situation like that where they simply cut the line, cut off people being able to participate. There's no telling for sure whether that would necessarily have harmed Sanders or Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if the presumption, say, in Arizona was like, oh, well, there's real Sanders momentum in Arizona, we have to, stop that. We'll prevent his, we'll cut it short so that what? I mean, like, if he's going to win a majority of the state's populate um, uh, uh, Democratic primary voters, whether he's getting whether there's a he's winning whether he's winning, say, 60% of a turnout of 40% of primary voters or 60%. I mean, if he's geared to win, the state. I mean, just arbitrarily cutting off at, say, a time. Oh, I see you're bringing up a
It's a Vox
thing.
News article. Yeah, it says within a few
Yeah.
days. It says Elizabeth Warren says she found no evidence the primary was rigged, but Warren now says that though there was some bias within the DNC, the overall 2016 primary process was fair. I think it's obvious that there was bias, especially against
Oh,
his atheism apparently.
that I don't know.
Oh,
No,
you
but
don't?
I can't imagine that being as big a problem in the Democratic primary as in the Republican.
Oh, I was definitely
But
surprised to see those emails. Yeah.
yeah, well, yeah, no, I will agree. Absolutely, there was bias by the Democrat Party establishment, and I'm it's very similar. There was bias in the Republican Party establishment against Donald Trump. Um, part of maybe the difference in divergent paths, of course, might be that Citizens United, which, while maybe being a big boogeyman for um, people on the left end of the political spectrum,
And just to explain
one,
what Citizens United is real quick.
oh,
It's essentially a
basic,
political action committee, right? That
yeah, you can essentially raise and spend endless amounts of money in a campaign if you're a political action committee, provided that you're not working in conjunction with a political candidate, because candidates do have certain restrictions on how much money they can raise and so forth.
mhm,
So you have these super PACs that, they're technically not part of the campaign of a candidate, but they really are.
mhm. And so
Like
Citizens
some.
United is basically, what is that, a Koch brother kind of a project, right?
Well, yeah, the Koch brothers have certainly used it to, dump heaps of money into campaigns for advertising and whatnot. So, yeah, usually the with a lot, you had a lot of candidates that had a super PAC backing them. Basically, the super PAC is being run by some billionaire's uncle who is, he's not actually taking orders from the campaign, but he knows what the memo is on, where to dump the negative advertising against your opponent or whatnot. But the thing is one of there's this view that what this system has led to is that basically the Republican Party structure atrophied considerably because they are just leaving a lot of this heavy lifting to these super PACs, whereas the Democratic Party establishment infrastructure did not atrophy as badly, so they were able to motivate. They're able to operate in such a way where they could get people, out to stop Sanders. I mean, that's not the literal thing that happened, but say here in Nevada, um, Harry Reid, I believe he was still in office, but it was going to be it was his last term. He based, he basically controlled uh, the Nevada Democrat Party. It was called, some people refer to it as the Reed machine, where he had, a strong party infrastructure. They had a strong turnout the vote thing. And if I recall correctly, Reed basically he pushed the panic button to help Clinton by making sure that the organized labor got out the vote to ensure that she actually came out on top in the Nevada caucus. So yeah, I mean, like when people say that, the Democrats cheated Sanders out of the nomination. I mean,
He
there
wasn't
was
even technically a Democrat. I mean, he came into it because he most closely aligned with the Democrats. It doesn't necessarily mean
right. Yeah,
he
Sanders is
represented.
an independent. Yes, he's not but he was running in the Democratic primary and obviously had a considerable amount of support within the party. But yeah, I mean, this stuff, maybe it did prevent him from being nominated, but it wasn't fraud. It was just you had a situation where, it's just the informal mechanisms were aligned against them. The super delegates were not on board. Not that they weren't even what made the difference. It's just you had the establishment party activists just throwing their weight behind Clinton, and it's not fraud. It's just they they preferred her to Sanders.
Do you
It's
recall
not.
Debbie Wasserman Schultz stepped down from the DNC? Do you remember exactly what it was? I
Yes.
mean, was it just because of the emails, or was there more to it than that?
Oh, that I'm not certain on.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
I remember seeing
I
her just now recently in the Cohen hearing, and I was like, what is she doing there? Is she
yeah,
actually a?
yes, because yeah, she's a member of Congress.
Mm,
But yeah, she's no longer the party chair, and I believe yes, she was partial to Clinton, whereas ideally she should be completely neutral.
yeah, I think when you step down from your position as the chair of a political party, I think you're pretty much saying, yeah, what we did and what we were doing was wrong. I mean,
Yes, yeah, well,
otherwise
yeah,
you don't
no,
step down. I mean, if you can justify it and you can say, no, I mean, this was clearly just the way politics is meant to operate, and we didn't do anything wrong, then you don't step down and you stand up for what you think, what you did was right. I don't think she should be in politics anymore at that point. I think if you step down, it's probably time to just resign. Isn't that typically what we expect politicians to do?
well,
Um,
yeah, I certainly understand the sentiment behind that.
yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, I mean, basically, uh, what I mean, she was not acting in terms of being partial to Clinton. That is not that was not supposed to be her function as the Democrat Party chair. Now, whether all this particular stuff amounted to like Sanders being cheated out of the nomination, I'm not so sure about that. I think I still as shady as maybe some of this stuff is. I feel like it's still sort of around the margins. The thing is Hillary Clinton won, a decisive number of states.
Mm-hmm.
She won. I mean, by any metric, I think what was her percentage margin that she beat
I don't know.
Sanders
I
by?
think I gave up paying attention once she got nominated.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like
right,
whatever. It's
right.
it's
But
over.
yeah,
Trump and Clinton going at it. Just was not interesting to me anymore. I lost interest. So
gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, so would if this stuff wasn't happening, would Sanders have gotten the nomination? I don't know, but I don't think so. Now, this time around, he very well could.
Hmm.
th- I mean, I think this whole thing started out, this particular uh, conversation started out by where I suspect the Democrats are heading. I mean, obviously, who knows who's going to be the nominee this far out from any actual nomination contest. You always have these polls, and it's just the candidates who are at the top. Sometimes they're the ones who are the nominees, but not always. I remember in 2008, Rudy Giuliani was leading the Republican primary polling at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So you just don't know. But I think what you have to keep in mind is with, say, the Democrat Party coalition is, you have different groups with different policy preferences, just like in the Republican Party. And you have to cobble together enough to get you to the nomination. Sometimes these coalitions that you put together, say in Hillary Clinton's case, she won in 2016 by having the establishment, and she had African Americans and she had Hispanics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what stopped Sanders. That's what killed him from being able to get the nomination.
Mm-hmm.
Was she had a firewall in terms of African American voters and Hispanic voters that he was just not able to crack.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, African Americans are basically the base of the Democrat Party.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting though is, that was who she was tapping in 2016, and Sanders was getting, he was getting like the left-wing vote. He was getting college town liberals as well as white working class voters in the Democrat primary. In 2008, Hillary Clinton was the candidate who was getting white working class voters in the Democrat primary,
Mm-hmm.
and Obama eventually received the support of African Americans, though that was actually he had to work really hard to be able to get that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Like, that's the thing. A lot of people forget that in 2008, the African American voters, they are in terms of the Democrat primary, they are very pragmatic. They want someone who can win. They want, they are not as apt to just fall for these like novelty candidates and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So they really only got on board with Obama after he won in Iowa, which is a predominantly white state. And they're like, okay, this guy can actually win white voters. He might be worth putting forward.
Which is kind of bizarre to me. I mean, Clinton, Hillary, and Bill in general, and their approach to welfare and to the African American community, I think, was deceptive, I think, to say the least. Did you know that that they worked with like Long's drugstores in urban areas to basically bring people in who are on welfare to work for $3 an hour with a welfare subsidy? I mean, that was started with the Clintons. And
well,
so,
yeah. Bill Clinton did sign that welfare reform bill back in the 90s. Yes. Well, yeah. No, it's always interesting to see. Sometimes where support goes to particular candidates seems really strange to a third-party observer. In this upcoming primary, who knows? Like, I think, you have 4 or 5 pieces of the Democratic coalition. You got the left wing, you got African Americans, you got Hispanics. There's the party establishment. Sanders is obviously a strong contender with the left-wing vote, but this time around, he's got more competitors for that because you have Elizabeth Warren. I mean, she's obviously staking out her position there. To a lesser degree, Kamala Harris, and then even Cory Booker and Kristen Gillibrand are trying to get in on get at least a slice of that vote.
Do you see any of them messaging in a way that's going to rally more traction?
Mm. I think the thing is with Kristen Gillibrand, I think
And I
her
guess that question goes the same way for Trump. Is there even anybody in that party that can really, that you think could rally or change things around? I mean, at this point, uh, American politics to me is so uninspiring that I just don't. I don't know. But do we even want that? Do we want somebody? That's how we ended up with Trump. I think strongly that that the way that he was able to inspire people, his story. When the RNC came out, I watched it and I was just like, I mean, I wasn't inspired by it, but I was like, okay, clearly this is going to turn some heads. People are going to be, um, you know,
right. Well, yeah, no, you're correct in that. Like Trump was not this measured politician who said everything based off what 50,000 different polls told them would be the safest course, which is what Hillary Clinton came off like. I mean, you very much get the feeling that literally everything she said on the campaign trail had been conceived of in committee and then like endlessly analyzed to make sure that it was as inoffensive as possible.
mm-hmm.
Um, but whereas Trump, because he just would say literally anything that comes into his head, like as a stream of consciousness. He came across in this way as having this like, he actually believes in something, which I don't think he does. He strikes me as, if I had to describe Trump as anything, I mean, his approach to politics is the same as his approach to business. It's just, yeah, he's just basically an amoral grifter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's probably going to be ultimately when he's out of office. I think the great irony is that the people who were his strongest supporters and who most absolutely believed in him are the ones who will have gotten none of their policy preferences actually met. I mean, he still hasn't built this wall. In fact, I kind of feel that my instinct is that he feels that he's probably better off with not building the wall because then if the economy heads south in 2020, he'll have something to campaign on. I mean, like if he builds the wall, that's no longer an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, what was the other thing I was going to ask you about? I can't remember now. I think we're to about an hour.
Okay.
Was there anything else
Oh,
you wanted to mention before?
yeah, I guess just real quickly, running all the way back to the Electoral College.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like if I had to choose, I mean, ideally, in a way, I kind of like the idea of how the Electoral College was originally set up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it was able to produce presidents like Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, consistently.
Wait, hold on. Did the Electoral College produce presidents like that, or did um, the culture and the society at the time produce those presidents? I mean, come on. Donald Trump is the product of the American culture. I think somebody who is it? Oh, Joe Rogan. He describes Trump as a poor person's version of a rich man, a poor American's version of a rich man, and it's
That's
not.
actually, yeah,
Yeah, the guy that like puts his name on everything. Everything is going to be gold. Like,
hmm I mean, yeah, he's not really even that amazing of a businessman. I mean, with his beef with the guy who runs Amazon,
oh,
the g-
Bezos. Yeah.
yeah, Bezos could buy and sell Trump's business many times over. I mean, Trump's business is basically just a series of like strange sort of branding operations and whatnot.
hmm
Um, yeah, well, yeah, no, to
So in
be
any
fair,
event,
I think,
the electoral college didn't produce the presidents. It helped to it was part of the non biased. It was the function by which they were elected. Let's just put it that way.
okay, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, no, that's certainly fair.
You don't think that they could have been elected without the Electoral College?
Well, certainly in Washington's case, he absolutely would have. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, basically yeah, no, I'll concede the point that like with some sort of national popular vote, you likely would have had a candidate. They probably could have won. But the thing is like the the thing is like if you look at the results of the 1789 election, um, where you have uh, electoral votes for George Washington, John Adams, John Jay. I mean, those first couple of elections very much had at least some aspect of these guys were actually trying to pick the best statesman possible. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, it took all of like a few elections before party machinery figured out like, oh, well, if we just make sure the electors that are sent are just hack party loyalists, then we can we can coordinate and make sure that our preferred candidate is the one elected president. Yeah, no, I'm not a fan of the Electoral College. I'm not saying we shouldn't change it, but I think there are bigger things that should be addressed, like gerrymandering and whatnot. But the thing is what drives me crazy is that many of the arguments for and against it just are not true. Like, you have the thing about like, oh, well, it keeps, it makes sure that candidates don't just visit the big states. They'll visit the small states too. There is like virtually no correlation between how big a state you are and how small a state you are, in terms of how much candidate attention you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that determines how much candidate attention you get is actually how much of a swing state you are. If the election is really
Right.
close, those are the states that are going to get attention.
Mm-hmm.
California and Texas got no visits. I think actually Texas may have gotten one from Trump, but they got no campaign rallies during the general election, despite being the two biggest prizes, because they already knew how they were going to go.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, Nevada, I believe, got something like 17 distinct visits between the two main candidates because our electoral votes were up in the air and available. I also
It
what
seems
the
crazy that
thing.
electric can be manipulated that way, by like, who's your favorite aunt? Well, the one that comes to stay at my house, 3 times a year versus the one that, that I have more in common with, but only comes to stay, once or maybe doesn't come at all for 10 years. Well, I'm gonna go with the one that stays with me more often. Like, even though I can't really stand her, it just seems like it's such a bizarre way that people, measure whether or not a candidate is doing their job in campaigning, is whether or not they show up someplace physically, stand around
Well,
and yell at a podium.
well, that's fair enough. I mean, the funny thing is like candidates didn't actually do campaigning for much of the 1800s. They were expected to stay at home, and party representatives were the ones who did the campaigning. But you're right. Just being able, just having the candidate visit your town isn't necessarily a good reason to vote for them or not. But the thing with campaigning though is like it gives people a chance to actually see a candidate and hear them for 2 hours or however long talking about what they believe in and so forth, which is
Hmm.
more than just the 30-second bit on the evening news.
True.
And it also, um,
Well, with YouTube now, though, too, candidates should be putting more of their own sort of production out there, and I think that they do, but I'm not sure how many people are actually interested in listening to that.
well, I think maybe Donald Trump hit upon the golden strategy, which is apparently just to put out a tweet that's only 140 characters or whatnot, but gets hours of coverage the
Hmm.
next day by
Hmm.
the news. It's
Yeah,
a
there's no bad press. I think that had to have been part of his mantra. The
yeah.
the the communicating directly with people through Twitter, I think, has another been just a really successful tool for him that I just blows my mind that we have a president who's doing that. But uh,
Yes, yes.
yeah, leveraging those types of tools, I think, are going to be more responsible for electing him again or not. But
Oh yeah, no, for sure.
whether or not the Electoral College comes through as a tool that's useful or not, I don't think it is.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, it doesn't. Its main effect, other than about 5% of the time, the winner will be someone who didn't win the popular vote. But basically, for people who are either for or against it, here's really what it comes down to. The Electoral College's main effect is it ensures that the good people of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina are going to receive lots of presidential visits, and their television commercial time is going to be flooded with ads.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be in these visits, and probably the last and the biggest thing that drives me crazy is when people say, well, if we got rid of the Electoral College, people won't visit the small countryside. They'll just all campaign in the big cities. No, first of all, people don't campaign in the big cities or the rural countryside because A, we already know how they're going to vote. The big cities are overwhelmingly Democrat. The rural countryside's overwhelmingly Republican. You're not going to change very many people's
Well, hold on.
opinion.
Consider this though. Let's say there's a significant number of people in California who don't even bother going to vote, especially for the presidential election because of the Electoral College. Whereas if you were to go directly to a popular vote entirely, you might see even more Democrats voting in red states. You might see even more conservatives voting in blue states, hoping to all of a sudden their vote actually counts and makes a difference.
That's actually, I would say that's actually possible, very, very likely, because the if we eliminate the Electoral College, um, and the thing is candidates, they campaign in the suburbs because that's where the swing voters are. Those are where you can find people who might be persuaded to cast their ballot for you. And as it is right now, basically the Electoral College ensures that the candidates are visiting suburbs in Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, Texas, Montana, California, Rhode Island are all virtually ignored. If we did go to a national popular vote, you would probably have a situation where the candidates would be visiting all 50 states or very near close to it. And granted, they're not, this it doesn't matter. They're not changing like whether they're voting in visiting cities or rural countryside. They're still just visiting suburbs, but they're visiting suburbs in all the different states.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I think, the biggest, most consistent change you would get if we eliminated the Electoral College would be that different groups of people living in suburbs in different states would probably receive more or less campaign attention as campaigns adjust to this. And that, I mean, I think you make a good point. That could very well drive up turnout because people might feel more engaged to turn out, because you're absolutely right. If you're a Republican, or it could just as well work with a Democrat in California, you know how California is going to vote.
Right.
So some may not turn out just because if you're Republicans, like what's the point? If you're Democrats, the thing is once the candidate has carried your state, by 50% plus one, it doesn't matter if you add another 200,000 votes to that. It doesn't translate to any more electoral votes.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are in one of these overwhelmingly red or blue states, in some ways, yeah, it doesn't matter if you show up to vote for president because your state's already guaranteed to go one way or another.
Are you afraid of a situation like that causing almost it'd be almost like the Athenian Senate, right? I mean, basically where you just have like a direct vote. Everybody that's involved is suddenly becomes the entire populace, and they're able to make decisions based on on a voting system like that. Is that something that you would be concerned about? Or like, let's take, for instance, you're familiar with the blockchain, you're familiar with Bitcoin.
I know of it.
What if
I'm
what
not.
if they used a blockchain type system on people's phones? Then you're using your fingerprint to verify that's you in control of your phone, and then you use a blockchain type system to cast votes um, that would translate directly to democratic representation. Is that something that would concern you if that started to happen, or if they decided
Oh,
to go towards something like that?
wait, run that by me again. That's
So
this is
yeah,
partially my ignorance of block. I know of it, how the basic idea how it functions, but
pretty much everybody has a cell phone, right? I mean, and
yeah.
there's government subsidies even to put cell phones in the hands of even homeless people too. So
Hmm.
essentially, what if you had an application that was installed by default on every phone? It would be registered, to you. Only you can have control over the device, and the metadata in the phone would even be able to verify that you were the one that was in control of it. It was your fingerprint that unlocked it to cast a vote, yada yada yada. And then the
Okay.
blockchain, the blockchain then is used to verify that your vote was actually cast. And it would be a so the purpose of the blockchain, for anybody that doesn't know, is that it's a decentralized register of transactions that's used
Uh,
for Bitcoin. So you don't have a central bank or a central authority over how much money is there. It's actually being shared amongst every single device. Every single device is actually all part of keeping track of how many transactions are happening from.
okay. Yeah, I think I understand exactly what you're asking. I mean, we're not talking about any a question of concerns about technological breaches or anything. It's about whether the system would essentially allow Athenian democracy because you have people able to vote instantly wherever they are. Um, whereas, I mean, that's one of the obstacles we would have to say a pure absolute democracy is just it's not practical because people can't organizing people to vote on every issue would just be logistically difficult. But with, say, this technology, if it's able to allow that, we could potentially go to the Athenian democracy sort of idea, right? Is
Hmm.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, uh, I mean, I am not too thrilled necessarily by the idea of having going to the extent where everyone's voting on like particular issues. I'm I very much believe in having representatives because they have experience. Uh, they develop a lot more issue familiarity. If we have people who are just voting, just that you're going to have a large chunk of people who are going to vote on stuff based off just amateurish understanding of things.
Hmm.
And if you're doing everything direct democracy, you could end up with all sorts of screwed up contradictory things that pass because they sound appealing. I mean, one of the things that like people overwhelmingly support term limits, and from everything I've read, term limits on members of Congress would be a horrible idea. It's just going to, it's going to add to polarization. The lobbyists are going to have way more experience than the actual elected people.
Hmm.
It's not really going to have the effect that you're looking for, but it sounds appealing. Both Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly love the idea of term limits.
And doesn't it even incentivize more extreme legislation once you're in and you know that you're only going to be there for 4 years, and what are you going to do after you're done? It's even
Mhm.
more reason to put through legislation that's going to guarantee you a job at that pharmacy or the pharmaceutical company or that Halliburton or that Boeing or Northrop Grumman or Raytheon,
Oh,
whatever.
yeah, absolutely. It is, it is absolute. It will guarantee gridlock. I I'm certain of that because one of the things that helps major legislation get through and problems getting solved is if you have these guys who have, say, 20 years of experience, they know how things work, they have a rapport with people on the other side, they can craft a compromise. And if you just remove them and you just have these people show up who have no idea how things work, and by the time they figure it out, they're gone. It's a prescription for paralysis.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you don't think that people should be able to make all those decisions instantly, but also that the people who are making the decisions have that it's a career for them. That being a politician is something that they should be doing probably for forever until they retire.
Yeah, I know it's not popular to like. I mean, it's popular to like to bash people who are just professional politicians, but that's the thing. If they're a professional politician, they know how things work.
Mm-hmm.
I that's actually who I want in office.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I don't entirely disagree, but at the same time, I think when a candidate or a politician is able to hide um, the influence that happens from special interests in the policy that they actually put forth, that's when things I think get problematic. The career politician that is making money in stock trades because they're influencing legislation, for example, and there's no real there's nothing that can step in and prevent that from happening. So
Yeah, no, that's a fair concern. Absolutely, I won't dispute that.
what was the
Yeah.
other thing? I had something else I was going to say. Oh, okay. So let's say that we do the people vote for politicians on their phone, get rid of the Electoral College. Everything can happen, within a matter of an hour. You know who you're electing. Would that
Okay.
would that be then you still have a representative democracy, but people have more access to being able to vote. Considering the fact that only 25% for the most part really came out and voted in the last election. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, how can you subject people to paying uh, income tax or paying any kind of tax? How does the government even have any sort of authority over anybody at that point if what they're subjected to is the will of only a quarter of the electorate? It's crazy.
Was it only a quarter?
I don't know,
I mean,
something
I
close to
know.
that.
Yeah, I know it's low. I mean, we're lucky if it ever reaches close to 50%.
Well, considering
Well,
uh, so the electorate that came out voted for Hillary and for Donald Trump, and I'm saying that I think it was like a total of 25% of the electorate voted for Donald Trump and were
oh,
able to
okay,
get him
yes,
elected. So
right,
considering that
yeah,
such a low
okay,
number of the electorate was able to make an impact like that.
yeah, the president. Yeah, I have uh, whether whether they're doing it on an electronic device or they're still just showing up at a polling place. I mean, I don't necessarily have a problem with just a popular vote. It's just I would actually prefer maybe if we did something instead of first past the post like we have. I'm not obviously you can't do proportional representation with the presidency, um, but I would be I would be willing to entertain something like having alternative vote or ranked choice where you rank your candidates in terms of who you prefer.
Mm,
And how that would work is that if someone gets 50% plus one, they're elected. If not, say they only get 42% because you got a major third party candidate or whatnot running, you go to whoever received the fewest number of votes, look at who their second choice was, and redistribute those. And you do this again and again until a candidate has essentially 50% plus one. And that way, whoever ends up in the White House has some sort of claim to have the support of the majority of the country.
mm,
Because if you're just doing it first past the post popular vote, whoever gets the most votes, it doesn't have to be a majority, wins, you can end up with that situation where, like you say, 25% of the country chose their preference for president is who we got. I mean, you can have that just as easily with a national popular vote with even 100% turnout if the field is divided enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else there?
I think I ranted about. I think I addressed most of my rant-worthy things concerning people's misunderstanding of the Electoral College. I mean, part of the reason why I agreed to do this was I was hoping, like, maybe, just maybe, I can get someone to change their mind on this, because I have run into people talking about how if we dispense with the Electoral College and went to national popular vote, only the urban centers would receive presidential visits, and the rural countryside would be virtually ignored. The thing is it's already virtually ignored.
Mm-hmm.
You look at where the two major candidates campaigned in this last election. Neither of them went during the general election. At least primaries are a different issue. Neither of them went to Montana or
Mm-hmm.
North Dakota or South Dakota or Wyoming. There was no point.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Maybe in the future I can, if people are arguing about the Electoral College, I can steer them towards this podcast, and who knows what effect it will
I'm
have.
not sure.
Probably won't have any.
I'm not sure what we might have. I mean, what do we come to the conclusion of at the end of this here? I'm not even sure we have a conclusion.
I don't know. I mean, I guess
you pretty much said
if
that it would be impossible anyway, so we just have to deal with it being there. And
that sounds like my thesis. I guess if we each had a thesis that we had to throw out, and this is a doctor. Did you ever take Dr. Ostergaard at
no,
UNR?
I didn't. Mm-hmm.
Okay, like Konecki, he's very much a quantitative empirical data guy,
Mm-hmm.
and that was one of his favorite things to throw out. If you were just up there rambling about something and you're going in circles, he would stop you and be like, "What's your thesis?"
Mm-hmm.
My thesis, I suppose, would be the Electoral College is not the ideal system to select a president, but the results are usually the same as the national popular vote. I mean, yeah, you have about 5% of the cases where their results differ, but usually what it is whoever wins the national popular vote, they also win the Electoral College. So really the Electoral College mostly it enhances the magnitude of their victory. Like in 2012, Obama was reelected with about a 4% popular vote margin, but he got 60% of the electoral votes.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were, so my thesis is if we were going to want to change our electoral systems, dispensing with the Electoral College is not necessarily where we would get our best bang for the buck. We should concentrate on gerrymandering and maybe switching to a ranked choice voting. I think that would have much better effect at curing some of the poisonous politics we got going on. I don't think dispensing with the Electoral College, I don't think it's going to do anything regarding that problem. So that's my thesis.
All right. Well, yeah, if I have to finish it off and add a conclusion, I guess mine would be just that I think that you lose some legitimacy in a democracy when any contest, doesn't matter if it's just the president, that in this case is somehow weighted to where an individual's vote is in some cases either more valuable or less valuable than any other individual within the same system. In my mind, that right there is the core to why it's just the wrong thing to keep around. I think that, and then the sort of the sense that, like you're saying, that you're rejecting that they already ignore these smaller states anyways. But the sense that that the reason why we have to keep it around is because if we didn't have it, then these smaller communities wouldn't have the teeth or the traction to be able to make a difference in the overall election. I think that's such a lie,
Mm-hmm.
that I think that the fact that we don't have somebody coming out saying that it's a lie is probably more of a problem than anything, because in the end, everybody knows that it's a lie that can either hurt them or benefit them, and they're all just kind of saying, well, since it is such a pain in the ass, maybe we'll go along with the lie and hope that it helps us rather than hurts us.
Right. It's like with your favorite NBA team. Eventually, the number of calls by a referee that hurt them will get balanced out by the calls that benefit them as well, or something along those lines.
But at the
Yeah.
same time, I don't think that removing all impediments to voting would be the best way to go either. I think that that would be extremely dangerous. We'd end up in an American Idol style democracy.
Wasn't there an episode of the Orville that was something like that?
I
Or
don't know. I
I
haven't
don't
seen
know.
that. But
Neither have I. I just heard something. Yeah,
but
no,
so yeah, I like the ranked choice idea. I haven't heard of that before. Uh, I, I do kind of enjoy the idea of a blockchain voting type system, but at the same time, you know, that's one of those, you're removing an impediment to voting that could, you know, that leads to that American Idol style. But in any event, yeah, I think that's. I think in most cases there should be fewer impediments to people being able to
hmm
vote. I think that there's a huge problem with voter suppression in a lot of places,
hmm
and that it should be easier. But at the same time, I think that, you know, I guess you have to make it somewhat difficult.
Yeah, well, no, I understand exactly what you're saying, because you do have situations where like people in certain counties, like they don't have the access to polling places that people in other locations have. You can suppress voting through all sorts of things, just minor stuff like that, where you're not actually prohibiting someone from voting, but by making logistical aspects of it so difficult, you can discourage it. And that's where I suppose your blockchain idea does, in regards to that. I think, you know, that has merit, but also I agree. Like, I think, you know, if anyone is just able to vote without putting in any effort to it, I think it could produce some very bad results. There's a line of thinking amongst some political scientists that it's actually kind of good to have a fairly large chunk of people who aren't politically engaged. Who, yeah, I know this sounds like, but this sounds crazy, but I understand what they're getting at here, which is that, you know, if everything's political and you're everyone's highly invested in it, and it just makes these political fights all the more intense. Having people who are just kind of, you know, a set of people who aren't going to get angry about everything. They kind of have this calming aspect to society that wouldn't that if we were all invested in, may not necessarily be the case. I mean, I'm not saying this is necessarily something I agree with, but it is something that some people entertain. So yeah,
Well, it's been an
but
interesting conversation, Robert. I think we should probably, you know, come up with another topic and do it again sometime.
oh
Maybe,
yeah,
maybe
I enjoyed
find
this
something
immensely.
interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we'll probably just release the audio, even though I did record it with video. I don't have a webcam, so.
Okay,
And
so
you,
you haven't been sitting here staring at me as I like wave my pen around in my hand and
no, I have.
okay.
You can see my screen. You can see what I have up.
Oh yeah, sorry. Whatever. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. Let's think of another topic and do this again at some point,
Yeah,
whenever's
yeah.
convenient for
Maybe
you.
we'll do it like bi-weekly or something like that. We'll see. We'll see how many
That
people actually listen to it.
yeah. No, that sounds good to me. My other podcast is bi-weekly, so I
Nice.
can just alternate.
All right, cool.
Okay.
All right.